Dive into the deepest, most disturbing cave diving incidents of the century.
It's a common misconception that only risk-takers engage in cave diving. At first glance, it appears to be a dangerous pastime. Therefore, it stands to reason that those who engage in it must have a propensity for taking risks. But if there's one thing you have to learn about cave diving, it's that most cave divers don't want to take risks. Planning out these dives involves a lot of math, chemistry, and physics, which is something that is really underestimated and that most people usually ignore. Even though these ideas are hard to grasp, they frequently mean the difference between life and death while cave diving. And that was the case with Wodek Szymanowski. So what happened to Wodek Szymanowski? And was it something that he would have foreseen? Well, let's find out. Wodek Szymanowski, a Polish native born in 1958, first learned about cave diving at the conclusion of high school. Then, when he arrived at the university and saw that they had classes that really allowed him to go cave exploring, he immediately signed up. Wodek was not only a really upbeat and positive person, but he was also one of those individuals who was just brilliant at anything they attempted. Because of how rapidly he studied everything, he became an expert in it. He was among the very first stockbrokers in all of Poland, and he was quite successful in this line of work. Along with his passion for cave exploration, he was an accomplished climber who had already conquered the Tatra mountain range in Poland, the Dolomites in Italy, and the Swiss and French Alps. But then, cave diving began to gain popularity, and he saw many of his colleagues switch from dry caving to underwater caving. As the business changed in that direction, Wodek decided it was time for him to follow suit because he had always wanted to start diving. Wodek naturally began with some introductory classes, but due to his caving expertise and natural abilities, he swiftly rose to become one of Poland's top divers. Then, in April 2005, he went on another one of his frequent trips to France. This time, he went to Bourg Saint-Andéol to look into some of its unique flooding systems. And these are indeed some uncommon systems. Goule de la Tannerie, which is the biggest, is more than a kilometer long and at least 210 meters, over 700 feet deep. Goule du Pont is nearly as deep, but a little shorter in length. Along with being enormous, these caverns are also full of gorgeously colored limestone passages and crystal clear water. Wodek decided to visit both of these caverns over the course of 2 days rather than just one, because if a little is good, more is better. Later, on an April morning, Wodek got ready to go into one of these unassuming ponds by putting on all of his gear in the cobblestone parking lot of the park. This was intended to be the Goule de la Tannerie, which is unusually formed in that it spans horizontally for more than 2,000 feet, or 610 meters, and only reaches a depth of less than 30 feet, or 9.14 meters, before deepening. But after that first horizontal tube, it immediately descends to that enormous 700-foot depth. A 300-foot, or 91.44 meter shaft in one portion plunges almost vertically into the ground. But because of how much gas you have to bring with you and the length of that first horizontal portion, it's sort of impractical to go very deep. He would reserve his planned deep dive for the following day in the other cave. Wodek and his crew went back to their lodgings after finishing that day's work and testing all of their equipment so that they could get a decent night's sleep in preparation for the next day's record-breaking dive. And because Wodek wanted to break his own depth record and raise it to over 400 feet, this dive was going to be exceptional. Goule du Pont was ideal for this, since it swiftly fell without adding much horizontal space. This allowed him to break his own record for depth in this beautiful cave while spending less time underwater. The next morning at 9 a.m., he and his team returned to the pond to prepare all of their equipment. He would be utilizing his preferred rebreather for this dive, along with 2 backup gas cylinders, one with air for the shallower areas and one with trimix for the deeper sections. Even though a rebreather is more complicated than a regular system, it has some advantages, like letting you stay underwater for a long time. Rebreathers, on the other hand, are pricier and more intricate, but that's also exactly what Wodek enjoyed. Even when simpler equipment was available, he frequently chose more sophisticated items because he enjoyed fiddling with them. He completed his lengthy pre-rebreather checklist to make sure everything was in working order before diving in. He posed for a few photos on the surface before dipping his head beneath the water. In comparison to his conception of caverns, Wodek was bulkier due to the rebreather and more cylinders, but in Gueule de Pont, there was just one narrow passage near the cave's entrance. For rebreathers, you must keep an eye on the oxygen content of your breathing gas as you progress through the water-filled corridors and adjust it to the depth you are at in order to equalize the pressure. Additionally, you need to keep track of the data on your dive computer and check the pressure in your cylinders. Additionally, you need to pay attention to how rapidly you're dropping and how long you've been submerged. It's not as simple as simply adding air to your buoyancy device. At different depths, different amounts of air are needed to give the same amount of buoyancy. That is because air gets smaller and less buoyant as you go deeper. The inverse is then accurate as we move upward. And you have to accomplish it all in a maze of completely dark tunnels, being careful not to bump into anything or kick up any mud lest you effectively go blind. As you might imagine, even with a clear brain, keeping track of all this demands a lot of attention. If you make a mistake and don't have a clear head, things might quickly become extremely ugly. Wodek descended diagonally from the surface to the first and only limitation at around 35 feet at 10 o'clock. Not wanting to disrupt the silt, he cautiously eased his tanks and equipment through. The cave continues another 165 feet virtually horizontally after the initial dip. There is a sudden drop down a 30-foot vertical shaft at the end of this tunnel. When he got to the hole, Wodek put his body in a way that let him drop while staying flat. With the tools he was employing, this was essential. But then, Wodek's problems started. Divers breathe a mixture of different gases in addition to standard air to counteract the narcotic effects of various gases. This narcotic effect is like being very sleepy or drunk, but it doesn't affect your reflexes or judgment. This is somewhat mitigated by the mixture of gases that deep divers employ, but it can still have an impact. Narcosis affects people differently, even changing from day to day within the same person. Some people have an odd tolerance to it, while others are extremely susceptible to it. Wodek most certainly saw that this narcotic effect was especially acute that day when he descended to below 200 feet. But being incredibly skilled and only 140 vertical feet from his depth record, he probably figured it was simply one of those days and kept going. It's also likely that he was already substantially disabled at this stage of his dive. The steep steps come to an end at 260 feet below the surface, when there is another brief level corridor. Wodek's ability to think clearly was deteriorating, but he was so close to finishing that he couldn't stop. Just one more drop would be enough before he rose again. Unfortunately, this would be his last and most devastating mistake. Wodek actually had no business being in the water that day. He had made a blunder that had already ruined this endeavor before he had even entered the water. Divers employ a combination of oxygen, helium, and nitrogen called trimix, which comes in various ratios for different depths. This has to be somewhat accurate and exact. Oxygen poisoning occurs when there is too much oxygen present. Hypoxia results from getting too little oxygen, and so forth. Wodek had never tested the combination he was using and had either combined the incorrect gases or grabbed the incorrect tank. He was inhaling far too much of the incorrect gas combination, which is why it was extremely intense. He began to descend after swimming over the ledge of the last 100-foot vertical shaft. Wodek kept a close eye on his oxygen, pressure, and everything else, but he still made mistakes. His thoughts were clouded, and he couldn't quite make out what was going on as he fell. He wasn't adequately equalizing the pressure, which is why his breathing became difficult halfway down the vertical shaft. He kept going down quickly until he eventually hit the ground. He attempted to switch the circuit to the spare cylinder on his rebreather since he was now 360 feet under the surface and barely able to breathe. But when he finally understood and began breathing once more, he was either too impaired or semi-conscious. He then started breathing in water after the mouthpiece fell out of his mouth. The surface team became aware that something was off at about 3 p.m., so they made 2 efforts to save Wodek at a depth of 230 feet, but he was still out of their grasp at that point. These failed attempts led them to the realization that Wodek had perished somewhere in the depths of Gul Dapol. Then, the next day, his body was found at the bottom of a vertical shaft, 360 feet below the surface, with his mouthpiece out and 2 full backup cylinders. So, was Wodek right to use rebreathers instead of normal, simpler equipment? And do you think that mistake cost him his life?
And today, we are adventuring on the beautiful Merritt's Mill Pond in Marianna, Florida.
This is a cave diving story unlike anything I've previously told. A diver named Raymond and his family entered one of the most challenging and deadly caves in the world. Accompanying Raymond was his daughter, Alexandra, and his son. Cave diving is a very dangerous exploration to attempt. The crystal clear waters of Twin Caves can be alluring to divers, but its beauty masks dangers that only trained and experienced divers are aware of. To start with, maze-like caves are usually totally black, which can be disorienting and confusing, and silt particles at the bottom could minimize visibility. In addition, the Twin Caves is rugged and has features that damage scuba gear and can cause diving equipment failures. A cave explorer, Andy Pitkin, once recounted his experience. The rapidly flowing spring water often contains rock and shell particles which can find their way into every inch of gear, causing diving equipment to jam. Twin Caves drains into Merritt's Mill Pond in Jackson County, located just east of Marianna, Florida. The scenery of the Twin Caves is breathtaking, and this might explain why Raymond and his family attempted to dive in despite the risks. After hearing a couple of fascinating stories about the Twin Caves, Raymond and his family wanted to experience it themselves. On the dive day, the water was crystal clear with many shades of blue. The group put on their gear, wished each other luck, and slowly dipped below the water. They then swam to the entrance of Twin Caves, where they could see another party of divers coming out of the tunnel through the crystal clear water. The first person to enter the cave was Alexandra, who was shortly followed by her father and her brother. She was carrying a pistol-grip dive light and a single tank. She was amazed at the cave's beauty when her light illuminated a portion of it. The cave has amazing characteristics that made diving a lot of fun. To avoid damaging her equipment, Alexandra's major concern was to avoid swimming too close to the sides. She also wanted to make sure that her father and brother stayed along the dive line and just behind her. She used an up and down flutter kick to go through the cave, stirring up the silt that was starting to accumulate and obstruct her vision. She assumed that if she kept swimming, the level of silt would eventually reduce, but it only got worse. Suddenly, it dawned on her that she couldn't see anything. Her breathing got heavy and shaky as she suddenly found herself in a dangerous situation. With all this happening, she decided to turn around to see if her father and her brother were still behind her. However, they were not there. They must have also lost their way between all the silt flying everywhere. This got her tensed up and she started kicking even harder, raising more silt to the surface in the process. Eventually, she could not see her hands in front of her face. As this was happening, the other group of divers that Alexandra met earlier began to observe the massive silt cloud, but lost sight of Alexandra, her dad, and her brother. The leader of this group, Andrea, figured that Alexandra and her family must have made it out, or at least Andrea was hoping that was the case. Andrea and her crew realized that they were in a dangerous situation and that they needed to get past the silt and out of the cave immediately. Andrea signaled to her husband and her friend to follow her closely, and with a bit of luck on their side, they got out of the silted area before they could get trapped. As the silt filled up most of the cave, Raymond lost track of Alexandra and he pushed further into the cave to look for his daughter. Luckily, he found her and signaled to her that they needed to get out immediately. They were beside each other, but they could barely see each other's faces. This is when panic set in. Raymond grabbed his daughter as he guessed which direction was the entrance of the cave, and they started swimming in that direction. Unfortunately, they had no idea which way was out as they were blinded by the silt. As they were swimming, Raymond found a wall and they moved along it by feeling it. The danger here is that if they were to mistakenly hit something sharp and it cut or pulled out their diving gear, they would be in a life or death situation. In a bid to make sure this didn't happen, Raymond let go of Alexandra to quickly adjust his air tank inline to protect his gear. When he reached back for her, he couldn't find her. He realized that the situation had worsened, and in the heat of the moment, he decided to continue along the wall. hoping that Alexandra had done the same. He made significant progress, and with each passing moment, he could see that the silt was starting to clear out, which gave him a huge sigh of relief. He was able to reach the surface, and he took a deep breath of fresh air as he stepped out of the water. As he was treading water, he looked around for his daughter, Alexandra, but he couldn't find her anywhere. Before Raymond got out of the cave, Andrea and her group of divers bumped into something. It was Raymond's son. He grabbed Andrea, and she gave him the thumbs up to leave the cave. Raymond's son, Andrea, and her husband were able to get out of the cave before they were in any danger, albeit by a stroke of luck. Raymond's son urged Andrea and her husband to call emergency services, as the rest of his family may be trapped inside the twin caves. As they were talking, Raymond swam towards them and asked if anyone had seen Alexandra. They all said no. Fear struck Raymond as he realized that his daughter may be trapped in the cave's blackout. Raymond began frantically searching the entrance of the cave for any signs of his daughter. However, Andrea and her husband were able to calm him down, and they put a call through to cave rescue specialist Ed Sorensen. When he got there, he changed into his scuba gear and entered the water. At first, it was hard to find the entrance as it was still silted. He eventually found the entrance, and as he entered, he tied on a primary reel using the Go dive line and started making a search pattern. As he swept his arms in the water, he felt nothing, and it seemed like time was running out. While he was searching, Alexandra found an air pocket in the cave, though she didn't enter the air pockets with a lot of carbon monoxide. Ed still had not found anything at this point, and his air was running out. Suddenly, his arm hit something, and he swam toward it to take a closer look. It was Alexandra's leg. He then swam up to the air pocket where he met her crying. His priority was to do his best to keep her from panicking, as that could make the situation worse for the both of them. Ed decided the best way was to follow the emergency line that he had tied to the outside of the cave, and then things became worse. They found themselves far from the exit, and their reel got tangled with Alexandra. Throughout the trip back, Ed tried to calm her down by assuring her that he would bring her home safely. He ditched the line and cut Alexandra free, which meant that they were now swimming blind. However, due to Ed's familiarity with the twin caves, he was able to navigate his way out with Alexandra only using his intuition. Do you think they could have avoided this situation? I hope you enjoyed this video. Dive deeper into the channel for more content like this, but don't get stuck. See you on our next dive. Today, I'm going to tell you a cave diving story that is unusual. A diver named Donald, who was obsessed with looking for new caves and mapping them out, visited a very deadly cave in New Jersey. He was accompanied by his two sons, Christopher and Roger, and 12 scouts. As we all know, caving is an incredibly challenging exploration to attempt, and it can be very deadly. One of those caves is the Crooked Swamp Cave. It's the most advanced and least visited cave in New Jersey. It is in the rural, north-central part of the country. It's a three-part cave system that was formed when many springs slowly dissolved. It has many parallels and connects various passages, amounting to 1,200 feet. It's said to be the longest cave in New Jersey. In the second part of the cave, to successfully reach the 5-foot high room, it's advised that it should be attempted by slim divers because of easy passage. It requires a lot of body squeezing to get past that stage, and because of the potential hazard in that area, great caution is to be exercised. That is why visitors need to inform the New Jersey Conservatory to arrange for a tour guide before exploring the Crooked Swamp Cave. On Saturday, March 27th, Donald, his two sons, and the 12 scouts explored the Crooked Swamp Cave. They made their way to the second part of the cave, which required crawling in with their hands and knees to get inside because of the small height and width of the entrance. For safety reasons, the scouts were told to stay together and even use a buddy system just in case of an emergency. Donald was not worried much about the scouts getting stuck because they were smaller than he was, but still, many obstacles could pose a threat. The walls of the cave were cold and wet with a pungent smell. Going through a small room at the back of the cave, a connection could be made from the cave to two other caves in the Crooked Swamp system. As a lover of finding new caves and mapping them out, Donald secretly wanted to find those two new caves that were connected to the second part of the Crooked Swamp Cave. He had previously made attempts to go through the small room, but always failed because his friends wanted to go back before getting to the room. Just like Donald, The scouts always wanted to find out the cave's connection and go through that small room that they had heard about. As soon as there was no proper supervision, the scouts scattered about and they started to explore the forbidden offshoots of the caves. Because of their small size and speed, it was quite easy for the scouts to make their way around the cave, but the scouts were scattered around. They were not following the instructions given, and it was becoming harder to control the situation. Seeing the way things turned out, Donald felt it was best to end the exploration. However, Donald wanted to go through that small room and discover the cave connection before ending the trip. At this point, Donald was extremely excited to explore a new part of the cave. Not taking note of his surroundings anymore, he began to make his way through the small room. As he continued to make his way in, the cave was getting narrower, and this was a challenge because he was bigger than the scouts. He was going deeper and squeezing his body to get through the passages. His clothes were ripped and slime-covered by that point, but he didn't care. All he cared about was getting to the small room. As it got deeper, the passages got extremely narrow, to the extent that he could no longer walk. He could only get through by crawling. First his head, then his body, into a cone-shaped passage. At first, he was trying to wiggle his way around, but it became unbearable in no time, and he realized that there was a problem. His shoulder and hips had been pinned, and his head had been stuck at an angle downward. He tried to squeeze and wiggle himself out, but to no avail. He continued trying to get himself out, but then he felt the passage getting tighter on him. It was becoming difficult for him to breathe at this point. He then noticed that he had freed a stone, and whenever he tried to move it back, it tightened, but when he moved forward, it loosened. As he tried to squeeze himself out, the freed stone kept getting him stuck even more. Now that he had started to experience a fast heartbeat, his heart had to work harder to pump blood to all parts of the body because it was upside down and adrenaline was increasing. The only thing Donald could think of in this situation that would get him out of this place was help from another person. And because of that, he called for help by trying to yell, but unfortunately, there was no one close enough to hear his voice. After some time, there was good news. One of the scouts, fortunately, was able to hear his voice and was able to trace the voice to where Donald was. The scout instantly rushed to where Donald's sons were and told him about their dad's situation so they could come help their dad. When Christopher and Roger got to their dad, they started trying to pull him out without delay, but it was far from an easy task because it took them about 1.5 hours trying to get a hold of him by the legs. Some other scouts joined them, but everything they were trying was not working. After everything failed, Roger suggested that they get a message across to the troop to inform them about their dad's situation, and that they needed urgent help to get him out of the cave. Christopher went ahead to do as Roger said. Remember, because of the downward position of Donald's heart, the heart was working overtime to keep him alive. The longer rescue was delayed, the higher the possibility that the heart would stop working. Many rescue groups were deployed from far and near to rescue Donald. They tried to pull him out with his feet, and they also approached from other sides of the cave, but all were not successful. To make matters worse, the temperature inside the cave was high, up to 57 degrees. He couldn't take in fluid or other sustaining provisions, and his position required lots of effort. It was a lot of pain for Donald. Another type of pain that he was experiencing was emotional pain. The thought of hopelessness as he was seeing all the rescue efforts not working, and all the feeling of regret that he allowed ambition and excitement to cloud what he usually teaches his scout troop, which is safety. More expert cavers poured in, and many strategies were tried, including drilling, ropes, and chiseling. They only had access to his feet, and that was not helping the matter. Donald was moaning in pain, losing more strength with every passing second. The situation was now helpless. The next day, rescue attempts continued, and more extreme steps were taken, which at the same time caused a lot of damage to Donald. For example, during the rescue, there were cuts inflicted on his back and head, some of his ribs were broken, and rocks hit him and cut his skin, which resulted in lots of blood loss. Donald was a mess, with pain all over. Because of his prolonged exposure to the cave's walls, his body temperature started dropping from 98.6 degrees to below 80 degrees. Rescue teams had concluded that he had no chance of survival at that point. Grunts were heard from him in the afternoon of the third day, but at that time, the rescue team was about to pull him just about 12 inches out of the cave, and doctors estimated that he would likely die from hypothermia or loss of blood. After 3 days of fighting for his life and all the massive rescue operations by several rescue teams, Donald was pronounced dead. 20 minutes after his pronouncement, the rescue team used dynamite and backhoes to tear him out of the bedrock hillside around the cave, and they were finally able to retrieve his body. I hope you enjoyed this video. Kindly drop your thoughts in the comment section. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to this channel to get more premium videos. See you soon.
The Devil Eyes is the most popular and frequently diving cave in the world, but only certified cave divers with dive lights are permitted to enter. If you are not careful enough, this cave can be life-threatening. Several things can go awry when you're exploring a dark cave underwater, such as equipment failure, losing your way, or trying to deal with close to zero visibility while making your way to the exit. One thing is clear: cave diving is not a sport for the faint-hearted, and yet, the sport still has plenty of fans who look forward to every dive with unbridled enthusiasm. But cave diving isn't always recreational. The risky activity is also an important tool for scientists to learn more about underwater caves and marine life. There was a fatal accident in a cave in Florida on Thursday, August 8, 2013. Carlos Fonseca, a resident of Caledon, Ontario, was diving in the Devil's Eye cave system, part of Guinea Springs in Florida. Mr. Fonseca had been diving for about 4 years and was full cave trained, Tremix certified, and side-mount full cave trained. He was a Wakula Award recipient for having conducted safe cave dives. Mr. Fonseca was preparing an aluminium 80 cubic foot tank that was permanently and clearly marked with O2, oxygen, and Melod 20, maximum operating depth 20 feet, as a stage bottle to 90 feet, in order to extend his penetration distance into the cave. His teammates observed that the Carlos was about to use an oxygen bottle for a greater depth than it was considered to be safe for, and questioned him about it. The oxygen bottle was intended to be used down to a maximum operating depth of 20 feet, as marked by the victim. Mr. Fonseca, who had a full mix/blend station at home, replied that he had filled the bottles himself and knew that the bottle was filled with air. Mr. Fonseca's teammates repeated their concern about the bottle in question, and the victim insisted that he knew it was air. Mr. Fonseca's computer was also set for air. No one had observed Mr. Fonseca analyze that tank that morning. The team continued to prepare for the dive and discussed the dive plan, reviewed the map, and made contingency and emergency plans to turn the dive if necessary. Mr. Fonseca proposed to not make any visual jumps during the dive, which refers to crossing a gap between the main permanent guideline and where a branch line begins, without a gap spool. The team entered the Devil Springs cave system through the eye in the Santa Fe River. They went upstream about 400 feet and were about 1/3 of the way between the park bench and Hill 400 when Mr. Fonseca began having a seizure and then lost consciousness. The partial pressure of oxygen was about 3.6 at the depth of about 85 feet, causing oxygen toxicity. His teammates decided to bring the victim to exit through the ear, going through a wide passageway known as the gallery, passing one restriction, and with a direct, easier path out than back through the eye. The teammates were watching Mr. Fonseca's face as they pulled him along for the 220-minute challenging exit from the cave, ensuring that his nose was pinched, his regulator was in his mouth, and observing whether he was breathing. Mr. Fonseca began breathing at 2 points on the way out of the cave, as well as at the surface prior to possible cardiac arrest. As the group surfaced and shouted for help, other divers, including cave instructors, assisted in getting Mr. Fonseca to the shore and commenced CPR. Mr. Fonseca was transported alive to the hospital where he was later pronounced dead. A cave instructor who took part in the rescue attempt later analyzed the tanks in the presence of members of the sheriff's department. The single-stage bottle was analyzed to be 98% oxygen. The partial pressure of oxygen was about 3.5 at the point of the seizure at a depth of about 85 feet, causing oxygen toxicity. The back-mounted double steel tanks were analyzed as having 30% oxygen.
We've been talking about cave diving gone wrong in the earlier videos, but today we'll talk about the cave that is fitting to bear the name, the cave diver killer. Over the years, cave divers have discovered several dangerous caves. These caves are classified as dangerous either because of extreme depth, extreme cold temperature, strong flow, or confusing paths. But just one is fitting to bear the name, the cave diver killer. The sign will give you a sense of how dangerous the cave can be. Imagine a cave sign with the message, "Stop. Stop your death. Go no further. There's nothing in this cave worth dying for. Do not go beyond this point." On the sign are also 4 facts written. They are: more than 300 divers, including open water scuba instructors, have died in caves just like this one. You need training to dive. You need cave training and cave equipment to cave dive. Without cave training and cave equipment, divers can die here. It can happen to you. At the end of the sign's message is a picture of the Grim Reaper with skeletons at his feet. This sign clearly shows how dangerous the cave is. What cave am I talking about? It's called Eagle's Nest Sinkhole, found northwest of Weeki Wachee Springs, Florida. Why is Eagle's Nest Sinkhole considered the most dangerous cave in the world? Let's get into the details. The cave is given the nickname Mount Everest of cave dives because of its extreme depth of about 310 feet. Unlike Mount Everest, the cave has killed many people who want to explore its beauty. Sylvester Muller, who was the vice chairman of the cave diving section of the National Speleological Society, called the cave a Venus flytrap. When you get inside the cave, you'll see lots of things that can easily capture your attention to the extent that you will not quickly realize how deep you've gone. Let's talk about what happened to 3 friends that dove into the Eagle's Nest sinkhole. Note that before the day they started to dive, about 8 people had lost their lives in the cave. 2 of the 3 friends are more skilled divers and had been to Eagle's Nest before. But according to reports, the 3rd friend had not explored the Eagle's Nest. The 2 more experienced divers' names are Peacock and Rittenmeyer, while the 3rd person's name is Blakely. At about 2 p.m. on Sunday, the 3 men entered the Eagle's Nest entrance water equipped with their scuba gear. The more experienced ones, Rittenmeyer and Peacock, dove deep, while Blakely, the less experienced one, was close to the surface. They planned to meet back at the agreed location by 3 p.m. At 3 p.m., Blakely was at the location, but the more experienced duo was nowhere to be found. After 30 minutes of exploring the surface, Blakely returned to the meeting point. Maybe his friends would be there, but they had not arrived. He checked back again after 1.5 hours, and Rittenmeyer and Peacock were still not there. When it was about 6 p.m., Blakely decided to call the police. The first crew of rescue divers that showed up searched the cave all through Sunday, but they couldn't find Rittenmeyer and Peacock. It was on Monday that another rescue diving crew found the 2 friends in an extraordinarily complex and dangerous area of the cave, at a depth of about 260 feet. Their bodies were trapped not far from each other. Remember that the 2 friends are more experienced divers. They have both had years of training and have dived in several cave systems throughout Florida, as well as in South America and Mexico, and yet they were trapped in the Eagle's Nest. This started a debate that had been going on for over 10 years about whether or not the public should be allowed to visit Eagle's Nest sinkhole. What happened to Rittenmeyer and Peacock under the water, and why were they not able to return to the surface? There are different speculations, like maybe they lost visibility, maybe they had issues with their gear, maybe they couldn't retrace their way back, or maybe something restricted them from going back. Some critics argued that even though there are many warning signs installed that tell people about the cave's danger, there is no way to force people to obey and prevent the inexperienced ones from diving into the depths because of how fascinating the cave is, which will put them in danger, and even the lives of rescue teams will be in danger if they attempt to save lost divers. An example of a novice that died at Eagle's Nest sinkhole is that of a father, Darren, and his 15-year-old son, Dylan, on Christmas Day. This was considered the most tragic incident at the cave. Darren and Dylan could dive, but both of them were not certified cave divers. They wanted to have some adventurous fun on Christmas Day, so they drove to a nearby dive site. However, it was closed because of the holiday. so they drove to the wildlife management area in Florida where Eagle's Nest is located. Unfortunately, they did not know about the historical danger of Eagle's Nest. From the investigation of their deaths, it was reported that they had gone down about 230 feet of depth, and they were not equipped to handle diving down to that depth. They did not have the proper training about how to dive at that depth, and they didn't have the right gas in their gas tank. It was assumed that the real trouble began when they got to the bottom of a section called the ballroom. The ballroom is a dark section of the cave, about 130 feet deep, where no lights can shine through to see the cavern's walls. From there, the section splits into two small caves that reach 300 feet in depth. Anyone who goes further than this place can struggle to find an exit and get lost. Darren and Dylan went further into one of the two small caves, and they reached a depth of about 230 feet. It was reported that what may have caused their death is called nitrogen narcosis, a drowsy feeling divers may experience if they dive 100 feet depth, which can make them feel drunk and lose concentration or a sense of good judgment. Nitrogen narcosis may have resulted from losing track of time and using too much air, so before they could get back to a safe depth, their air was dangerously low. Together with being low on air, panic may have made them forget to follow escape guidelines. Darren texted his fiancée just when they were about to start the dive, so his fiancée could guess when they would likely be back. After a long time of waiting, she went to look for them. She found Darren's car near the dock, but Darren and his son were nowhere to be found. It was then that she called the police. The police quickly arrived with rescue divers. They followed all the guidelines to look for missing divers and found Dylan's body trapped against the ceiling, just 6 feet from the ballroom's exit. They found Darren's body beside the warning sign that divers should not go beyond that point. Both Darren and Dylan's tanks were empty, and their mouthpieces had fallen out of their mouths. This and many other tragic occurrences have happened at Eagle's Nest sinkhole. About 150 divers, both experienced and inexperienced, have lost their lives. It was closed in 1999 because of the death record, but reopened in 2003. This confirms the Eagle's Nest sinkhole is fitting to give the title the Cave Dive Killer.